Holy cow. Boy. What, just a cow? Yeah, a little bit of a wrestling related topic. Sort of. It seems like ever since Charlotte Flair's success in WWE, I'm not a big Charlotte Flair fan. I never have been. But you know what? I think she is a future Hall of Famer. And she's done pretty well for being second generation. But let's be honest, that's a tough gig. When you got to follow a famous father or a famous mother, it's not easy. There's been more failures at it than successes because it's not easy. You're going to be compared to, no matter how well you do or how awful you do, to your famous father or mother. That's just the way it is. That's the way it's always been. And that's the way it will always be, because as long as there's wrestling, and I'm not just talking wrestling, I'm talking NFL, Major League Baseball, NBA, the whole 9 yards, that's a tough gig to follow. And then if you go back in time, a Flair that didn't succeed was David. Now, let me tell you, I remember from 99 to 2001, David Flair was all over WCW programming. And I always believed David Flair didn't have the love for the business like a Charlotte Flair, or even the famous dad, Ric Flair. I always thought David didn't want to be there. He was... Should I not hold anything back, Mr. Cal? What do you think? Okay. Alright. Even though I know you're not much in on wrestling, I just want to ask for your opinion. He was the drizzling shits. David Flair was the drizzling shits. He couldn't wrestle. He couldn't talk on the mic. He had no charisma. He had nothing. And I've always believed David didn't want no part of the wrestling business. Charlotte Flair did. She did want to be in the wrestling business. I think David was just pressured into it probably from his dad, and maybe his lifelong best friend and Arn Anderson sort of pushing him into it, because he got instant pushes and he was horrible. No matter who he was against, somebody had to carry the match because he was the drizzling shits. Now, why am I even talking about David Flair, you're wondering? What does that have to do with anything? Well, there's been a little bit of war going on between David and Rick. Now, I don't tend to be a psychologist, but I tend to think, and this is a common theme you will hear in wrestling, especially from the older veterans that are still alive, is they were on the road 250, 300 days a year. And let's be honest, Flair's went through quite a few marriages. I think it's 5, something like that, 4 or 5. And they didn't spend a lot of time with their kids. So this is a common theme you hear from sons, daughters, and their fathers. And they're resentful towards their father for not being home. And I think that's the problem with David Flair, is he's very resentful towards his father. So there's a little bit of a war going on social media platforms between David and his father. Listen, I'm not going to try to defend either one. I'm not going to try to defend Rick. Let's be honest, Rick's not the perfect human being. Nobody is. Nobody is. And I'm not going to try to defend David. I do know that it's sort of like Brooke Hogan and Hulk Hogan. They had a strained relationship because of all the days and years that Hogan spent on the road not being with his family. and hanging around the kids. Right or wrong, that's the way it was, and I think that still goes on, but not quite as much. Not quite as much. So, I think there's a little resentment towards David, towards Flair, and there's a lot of social media war going on back and forth between the others. And I'm losing my train of thought here. Where was I going with this? Oh, okay. So David sold sold a robe. It might be robes. Remember the robes that Ric Flair wore? Why his son has them, I don't know. I thought Rick would really hold on to those tight until he died, and maybe as he passed down, I don't know. So anyway, David sold one of Rick's robes that, as Rick said, that he let his son wear. How nice. Did Rick give any robes to Charlotte to wear? Probably did. I think he did. But be that as it may. So he let David wear one of his robes, which I can understand Charlotte wearing one because she's actually, made a name of herself. But David just was never going to. He was. I hate to keep harping back to that. He was just horrible. He was a drizzling shit. So Rick, and I'm trying to get into this, but I keep going off base here, literally and figuratively. So Rick is telling, not in person, but on social media. And Rick did delete some posts that he did do. And I feel like Rick's trying to poke a bear and David's trying to poke a bear. They're sort of poking each other, literally and figuratively, because, Rick's saying don't sell any robes, don't be using this part really confused me. And the more I thought about it, the more I'm like, who gives a shit how it's spelled? But, okay, he says not to use my wrestling name, Flair, F-A-I-R, but use the birth name, F-L-I-E-R. F-L-I-E-H-R. That's how it's spelled. That's the birth name. But come on. Who actually calls Flair Floor, however you say it? So it seems like Rick is just sort of picking fights. That's what it seems like. He's picking fights. Rick, come on. Just spend as much time you can with your son while you're still alive, because let's be honest, you're getting up there in age, and there's no question about it. And fights like this are needless and pointless. They're needless and pointless. I think David should maybe make an effort to probably try to get in contact with his dad and try to talk to him, because this may be like a Brooke Hogan situation, when after Hogan died, that she didn't have any contact with Hogan for a long time when Hogan was still alive, and so now she's starting to regret that. This could be the same situation that David Flair's in with his dad, Rick, because let's be honest, Rick's getting up there, and these needless, pointless, going back and forth on social media, why they have to do this, I don't know. Just keep it private. Keep it private. That is the major issue with social media. I'm guilty of it. We are all guilty of just putting our dirty laundry out there. And this seems more like dirty laundry being aired on social media to people that's nobody's business. It's nobody's business. Whose fault is this? Who knows? It could be Rick's fault. It could be David's fault. But they continue to go back and forth on social media, and it doesn't seem to be no end in sight to this. Maybe David was hard up for money because these robes, you can get a lot of money from these robes that Ric Flair has, especially if it's like one of his bigger matches he had at a pay-per-view. So you can get a lot of money for these robes. There's no question about it. Maybe David's hired up for money. Maybe he's into drugs. I don't know the whole story of it. I don't know. David's, ever since his retirement officially from wrestling after WCW closed, he really has stayed pretty much out of the spotlight. You don't hear much from David in the way these days, mainly just on social media. He doesn't have hardly anything to do with wrestling, because I think that wrestling wasn't for David. It wasn't for David. It was for Charlotte, but it just wasn't for David. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. A lot of second, third generation wrestlers do that. It's like, I don't want no part of it. I seen what my dad went through with it. And that's perfectly fine. But these two need to stop bickering so much and just try to get along for as long as you can, because we don't know how much longer Rick's going to be around. He's really getting up there in age. He's had a few health problems. He wants to have another wrestling match. That's an idea. That's an idea. Rick wants one more wrestling match. That's an idea. Have a wrestling match with your son David. They would be spending some time together. And again, maybe not.
Me and Mom are saying that's all for now.
That's all for now.